Hey everybody, Ruckdog here with the third installment of the Dystopian Wars 3.0 Captain's Academy. Today's episode is all about shooting, and we've got a lot to cover today. Sorry, this is going to be a little bit of a longer video, so let's get started. Alright everybody, welcome back to the Dystopian Wars 3.0 Captain's Academy, shooting. Here we go. So, what are we going to talk about this episode? Well, to summarize, we're going to look at line of sight, some big changes to those rules over the previous editions. We're going to look at firing arcs, the ranges for different weapons. We're going to talk a little bit about what lead and support weapons mean in the new edition. We're going to walk through the shooting procedure, and then we're going to go with a brief weapons overview for some of the different weapons you might see in the Commonwealth and Enlightened Orbats. And then finally, we'll just talk a little bit about how the shooting mechanics in Dystopian Wars 3.0 shape up against previous editions of the game. All right, so here we go. First off, take a brief second to look at where we fall out in the overall turn. We are still in the activation phase in the shooting step, so that's where we're going to be spending our time here in this video. So, talking about line of sight first. So here we have a very basic depiction of a ship in Dystopian Wars. In this version, line of sight is measured from the center of the model. So how do you find the center of the model? Well, basically, you bisect the model into two equal halves, forward to aft, and two equal halves, port and starboard. And where those two lines intersect, that is the center point. And that's where you measure all of your line of sight and your ranges from, as we'll see here in a minute. So, that center point is not necessarily marked on the model. You will have to kind of pick a spot and imagine where it is. For the most part, this isn't too hard to kind of fudge and figure out, but it's something that you might want to make sure you agree with your opponent beforehand and try and stay as consistent as possible as you go through the game. Okay, so here we have two different models, the red team and the blue team, just for the sake of simplicity. You can see that I've got both of their center points marked. And what we're going to do to determine line of sight is we're going to connect the line of sight between those two yellow dots, more or less. So, as long as we can see any part of the target, in this case, if the red ship is shooting at the blue ship, from the center point of the red model, then we can be considered to have line of sight on that target. Now, here's the thing. If you cannot see the center of your target, then that means that your target is obscured, which means that your exploding dice no longer explode. Still counts 2 hits, but they don't explode. So that's a significant downgrade or nerf, to use the parlance, to your firepower. And so in this case, you can see that if we cannot connect the lines of the line between the two center points of the models. So instead, we don't have full line of sight. However, you can see here that the red model can still see the bow of that blue model around the corner of the island, which means that the red model can still shoot at the blue model. It's just that the blue model is going to count as obscured, and the red model is not going to get the benefit of those exploding dice. Now, how does this work with other types of models? Well, it's based on the mass of the model. So in this case, we've got a mass 3 model trying to shoot at another mass 3 model. There's a mass 2 model in the way. However, because that mass 2 model is smaller than the mass 3 model, this has no problems for line of sight. Now, this is a little different when we start talking about a situation where you have a larger model than the target between you and the target model. In this case, a mass 3 model shooting at this mass 2 ship on the left there is going to have a bit of trouble because it cannot draw an unobstructed line between the center point of the shooting model and the target. However, we can still see the aft end of that mass 2 model behind the stern of the blue mass 3 model, which means that we can still shoot at it. Now this is again a defensive bonus for the mass 2 model because the red model is not going to get the benefit of any exploding hits that it rolls during the attack. Now, if the line of sight is completely blocked and you can't see any part of the target, in that case, you are not able to attack that particular target. So in this case, the red Mass 3 model shooting at the blue Mass 2 model is not able to do so because it cannot see any part of that blue Mass 2 model around that larger Mass 3 model. So this would not be a valid attack. Alright, so now that we've sort of talked about the line of sight, let's talk about firing arcs. So, in this version of the game, you only have 4 firing arcs measured in 9-degree increments around the center point of the model. You've got a forward firing arc, you've got your port firing arc, you've got your starboard firing arc, and then finally you have your aft firing arc. These are your 4 arcs. Now, it's important to note, it is possible to have a target in more than one firing arc. So in this particular example here, that red model would be able to be targeted by the gray model using both its starboard and its 4 arcs, and the red model in this particular case would not get the benefit of any kind of defensive bonus like obscured. Line of sight and firing arc are independent things. It's possible for you to be in multiple firing arcs, like I said, and where the target's center of mass essentially is at regarding your firing arcs doesn't matter. It matters where portions of the model are physically located regarding your firing arcs. So like I said, in this example, you get both your 4 and your starboard shots with no degradation to your attacks, unless that target, that red ship, has some kind of shield or shroud generator or some other such thing. So, range. Now, in this edition, we have 3 ranges. We have long range, closing, and point blank. They're 10-inch range bands, unless you have a special rule that modifies that. And this means that you have a little bit easier time. You do measure from the center of your model to the closest point of any target, okay? So that means you don't have to get to the center point of your target. You just have to get to any close point, just the closest point of the model. Whether that's a little piece of the bow or a little piece of the stern or some such like that, that's what you need to measure to. If a model is on a base, then it's also the closest point of the base. And that'll probably come into play later on when we start seeing more and more flying models, airships, and that type of thing entering the game. Notice that because of the way we're measuring range in this edition, it's impossible to have a target in multiple different range bands for your weapons. So a target now is only going to be a single range band, so you don't have to worry about, oh, is my forward turret at, say, long range, whereas my aft turret is actually in closing range, that type of thing. No longer applies because we're not measuring our ranges from the weapons mounting, we're measuring it from the center of the model. So, lead and support weapons. This is the new evolution of the old linking mechanic, for those of you that remember linking from the Spartan days. So your lead weapon is going to be the weapons that's selected to lead the attack, obviously enough. The support weapons are going to be those weapons that are contributing additional dice to that attack. Why would this be beneficial? Well, if you're shooting at a target that has really tough defenses, you want to maximize your likelihood of getting through those defenses and causing damage. And how you do that? Well, in this game, you roll more dice. So, there are some caveats here. A support weapon must be on the same model or in the same unit as the lead weapon. So, if you have a battleship that's in one unit and a group of cruisers that's in a different unit, the weapons on the cruisers are not going to be able to provide support to the weapons on the battleship because they're not in the same unit. However, the battleship that might have 3 or more turrets on there can use its own turrets to support a lead attack being made by one of the turrets. And then you also have to have the same weapons qualities. So if you take a look here, what we have to pay attention to on these is what our mass value is, because that's going to help us determine our line of sight. And we also have to pay attention to the list of our weapons and their arcs. Now, if you look at the weapons in the stats, this is where you start getting into those weapon qualities, as you can see there on the right. You have to have the identical qualities for your weapon in order for them to be able to combine. So in this case here, the particle beamer is not going to be able to provide support to the heavy arithmetic broadside or vice versa, because while they both have the sustain quality, they do not both have the gunnery quality. The other thing you're seeing here is that you've got the battle ready and crippled conditions for your weapons. That's what that red line is. The number that is in front, that is your lead value, and the number in parentheses is your supporting value number, or the amount of dice that you're going to add to your attack pool when supporting. No longer do you have to do the whole add up, divide in half, and round up or down thing you used to have to do for linking in the Spartan days. A little more streamlined. The other option is you can use unit cards. We've got these for the Commonwealth and the Enlightened. We may see them down the road. This provides the same information that we just looked at in the Orbats, just provides it in a little bit more of a concise fashion. You'll notice that we have the same firing arc and the same weapons band, or I'm sorry, range band information for the different weapons listed here on the card. You might be wondering what happens if you're crippled. Well, you basically just flip the card over to the crippled side, and it has the appropriately reduced attack dice values for your weapons in that crippled condition. Okay, so this brings us on to the shooting procedure. There's a few steps to this. You first of all figure out the amount of dice you get from your lead weapon. You add in the dice from any of your supporting weapons. Then, if your opponent has things like shields, or if you're shooting rockets that have the aerial quality and your opponent gets an aerial defense roll against them, that's when your opponent declares those defenses are going to be used. Now you roll your attack dice. You determine your number of hits. You determine and resolve counters. So again, in the rockets example, if your opponent gets heavy counters or counters, they subtract from the number of hits you achieved with your rockets. And then finally, you try and determine whether or not you beat your target's armor value and or the Citadel attribute. And that's going to determine how much damage and of what type you give to the target. All right, so let's walk through an example here. In this case, we've got two ships. The red ship is representing a Commonwealth Borodino battleship, and it's shooting an Enlightened Descartes control ship. That's what's being represented by the little blue pentagon here on our shape, or on our screen. Both models in the battle-ready condition. There's going to be no upgrades, just for sake of argument. All right, so remember our firing arcs. Here's a representation of the 4 firing arcs on the Borodino. We measure our line of sight and our range from the middle of our target to the middle of the other target. I'm sorry, the line of sight goes from middle to middle. The range just goes from the middle to the nearest port. In this case, we see we've got 12 inches. So that 12 inches puts us in the closing range band in the starboard arc for the Borodino. All right, so now we go to the stat cards, and we look at the Borodino, and we see what weapons we have in the starboard. So we're going to pick one of our heavy gun batteries to be the lead weapon. And that means in the closing range, we're going to get 10 dice from that weapon in our starboard arc. So that's our starting attack pool from the lead weapon. That's 10 dice. Next, we look at our support weapons. In this case, the other 2 heavy gun batteries on the battleship match the weapon's qualities of our lead weapon, which means that they can provide support to the lead weapon. So we've got a little parentheses there with a 5 next to both of those other 2 gun batteries, which means we're going to add 5 dice each in support for the lead weapon. So what we're seeing here is, if we were to sort of walk through the math, 10 dice from the lead weapon. We get 5 dice from our first support weapon, plus another 5 dice from the second support weapon, which gives us a grand total of 20 attack dice. So this is going to be a pretty hefty attack. That's a fair number of dice, a fair amount, a good amount. Okay, now in this case, the Descartes has no defenses. There's no shields. This doesn't have the aerial or submerged quality, which means we cannot use the aerial or submerged defenses. So in this case, the Borodino is basically just going to have to dish it out, and the Descartes is just going to have to take it on the chin, more or less. Okay, so moving on then, we get to roll our attack dice. So we give them a roll, okay, and then what we do is we take a look at our results. So the result of our initial roll is that we got a total of 5 exploding hits. These are going to give 2 hits each with an additional action die to roll. Heavy hits, which give 2 hits apiece, and then just our regular hits to give 1 hit. And then for the attacker, these heavy counters, and the blanks are just ignored. So, since we got all those exploding hits, we now have to roll the additional dice. So we roll 5 additional dice, 1 for each of the original exploding hits that we got. We look at the results from this, and we see that we got another exploding hit, we got another heavy hit, and we got another single hit. That means we have to roll 1 more die because we rolled another exploding hit, which means that we get to roll another dice for that exploding dice. And again, any counter results are ignored. So here we go. We roll our final die, and what we get is a counter, which just gets ignored. So now we add up all of our hits total. So those 6 exploding hits that we rolled total, that gives us 12 hits. The 4 heavy hits, that gives us 8. And then the 5 hits, that just adds 5 more. So adding that all together, we get 12 plus 8 plus 5, which is 25 total hits. Not bad at all. All right, so now we take those 25 hits and we see what kind of damage it did. First thing we look at is the target's armor value. Now, the Descartes' armor value is 7. And what we immediately notice is that 25 is greater than 7, which means that we take a point of damage. However, since we have more than a multiple of 7, we take additional damage for each multiple of the armor value. So essentially, we take those 25 hits and divide it by the armor value and ignore any remainder. So 25 divided by 7 goes into 25 3 times equally. So that means that we're going to wind up with a total of 3 points of damage. All right, not bad, but we're not done yet. Next, we have to look at the Citadel value. The Citadel value for the Descartes is 11. Now, if the number of hits you get exceeds the Citadel value, the target suffers a critical hit. Normally, you would roll a critical hit die and apply the result to the ship. However, in this case, not only have we exceeded the Citadel value, we've more than doubled the Citadel value. And when this happens in the game, the model takes a catastrophic explosion instead of a critical hit. So in this case, 25 hits, more than twice the Citadel value. So that's a catastrophic explosion, which is 2 more points of damage plus a disorder. So if we were to sum all that up then, we're going to subtract that amount of damage from the hull value. And it's going to cause us to flip the card to crippled status because we took a combined total of 6 points of damage, which is enough to remove all of our battle-ready hull and start to eat into our crippled hull. So this is a pretty big oof on the oof scale here. That was quite a wallop that our Descartes just took from that Borodino battleship. All right, so now that we've walked through the basics of how shooting attacks are done, let's start to take a look at some of the weapons. Here we have a portion of the Enlightened weapon reference. This comes from the Orbat, provided on the dystopianwars.com website. Now what you can see is that in general, the closer you are, the more dice you're going to have. You can take a look at the heavy particle cannon. That's sort of the most potent weapon on this list. You can see you get a whopping 10 dice as a lead attack from that weapon at close range. You can see that the amount of drop-off for your weapons when you go to the cripple condition is pretty significant. It's more significant for some weapons than others. You know, the etheric lance, for example, drops in half, basically, when you go into the crippled condition. Now, on the Commonwealth side, you'll see that you have some similar things going on, but a little different. You can see that for a few things, like the heavy torpedo salvo, you actually get even more dice than you might get for the weapons you have on the Covenant. And so if we put these side by side, you can start to see how things like weapons qualities are different, how the different range bands go up or down depending on whether you want to be closer or farther. You know, the heavy gun battery example, that's an interesting comparison to the particle beamers of the Enlightened, because with the Enlightened, generally the closer you get, the more dice you get. But if you look at the Commonwealth, you actually want to be more in the mid-range, in the closing, because for a lot of your weapons, like those heavy gun batteries, when you get into point-blank range, you get fewer dice than you would if you were at the closing range. So you can see how this is sort of an interesting way to add a little bit of flavor and a little bit of distinction between the different factions so they don't quite feel too samey. All right, so let's sort of wrap this up here as we tend to do with a discussion about how shooting in Dystopian Wars 3.0 compares and contrasts to previous editions. So the first thing that I've noticed is that in general you're going to see more hits per attack on average because of the fact that you now have heavy hits. So to equate this to previous editions of Dystopian Wars, it's as if your 5s now give you 2 hits. So 4's 1 hit, 5's 2 hits, 6 2 hits plus an additional die. That's essentially how this is working out. So that's going to tend to increase the number of hits you're going to get per attack. Our attacks are not simultaneous in this edition, which means that if I shoot you with my guns, and that takes you from a battle ready down to a crippled condition and reduces the amount of underwater defense that you have. When I then shoot you with my torpedoes, you're now going to have less defense against them because I've successfully whittled you down before shooting you with my torpedoes. There's no more insta-death critical hits per se. For small Mass 1 models, yes. If you get a critical hit on a Mass 1 model, the current rules do say that that's just an outright kill for that Mass 1 model. However, if you look at the critical hits, there's no longer a, if you get this critical hit, you die type of thing like there used to be in previous editions of Dystopian Wars. So that means that you'll be seeing less Mass 2 and Mass 3 insta-deaths on the table. It's still possible to do quite a bit of damage to a model in a single attack, as we saw in our example. But in terms of just getting that lucky roll, that lucky 12 or snake eyes on the 2d6 critical hit tables that the previous editions had, that's no longer part of the mix. Line of sight is much easier to determine. If you looked at the line of sight rules in previous editions of Dystopian Wars, a lot more complex, a lot more going on because you had 2 different levels of flying, you had 2 different levels of submerged, you had to deal with different types of terrain. In certain editions of the game previously, line of sight was not reciprocal, so it was possible for a large model to see you, but for you to not be able to see the large model. Sort of a mess. All of that has sort of been put by the wayside, I think, and simplified quite a bit and streamlined. Now a lot easier to determine line of sight. Firing arcs have been simplified, and this is one of my most favorite things, I guess you could say, about 3.0 is that we've gotten rid of things like offset arcs and fixed channel arcs. A lot of that caused quite a bit of analysis paralysis, I think, when it came to moving. I've written about this on the Man Battle Stations blog in the past, but I think that one of the things that tended to really slow down the previous editions of the game is having to more carefully position all of your models to make sure that you can maximize your somewhat complicated and somewhat difficult to manage firing arcs, especially those fixed channel arcs. Those could be a really difficult thing to work out just right at longer ranges, no kidding. There's fewer weapons special rules to manage, at least so far. The weapons qualities are not quite as extensive. You don't have things like munitions and so forth as you did in previous editions of the game. So that makes it a little less difficult to keep track of interactions between different weapons and different targets overall, I think. So that's sort of a big help in the end for speeding up the shooting process. All right, so summarize. We looked at line of sight. We looked at firing arcs. We looked at range. We walked through lead and support weapons. We saw a little example of how a shooting attack might go in the game. We looked at our weapons overviews briefly, just sort of see the types of dice and the types of weapons qualities that are out there. And we also just spent a few minutes looking at how this stacks up to previous editions of Dystopian Wars 3.0. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate you guys taking a look and providing the feedback. Keep it going. Always looking to try and improve my YouTube video making skills. For the next edition of the Captain's Academy, we're going to take a look at boarding. That's our next major topic. So I hope to see you all back for that video, hopefully within a week or so. All right, stay tuned. This is Ruckdog saying good luck and good hunting.